Imagine you are the most powerful empire on earth. You have conquered Britain in the north, Egypt in the south, Persia in the east. Your legions have crushed kings, burned palaces, erased entire civilizations from the map. You do not negotiate. You do not hesitate. You do not spare. And then, you stop. Right there. At the gates of one city. A city that was not bigger than Rome. Not richer than Rome. Not even militarily stronger than Rome. And yet, Rome looked at it, thought very carefully, and decided, we will not destroy this one. Why? That question has haunted historians for 2,000 years. Because the answer reveals something Rome never wanted to admit about itself. Something that exposes the psychology of empire, the politics of fear, and the strange, terrifying power of a city that had already died once, and come back. That city is Carthage. And this is not just the story of a city. This is the story of the most complicated relationship in ancient history. A century-long rivalry that shaped the entire Western world. A rivalry so intense, so personal, so filled with rage and respect and absolute terror, that even after Rome finally did destroy Carthage, it could never truly forget it. Let's go back to the beginning, around 814 BCE, on the northern coast of Africa, in what is today Tunisia, a group of Phoenician settlers founded a city. The Phoenicians were already legendary. They were the greatest sailors of the ancient world. They had invented the alphabet. They had built trading networks stretching from Lebanon to Spain. And now, they planted a colony on a small peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean Sea. They called it Carthage. In their language, that meant new city. The Greeks would call it Carchedon. The Romans would call it Carthago. We know it as Carthage. Now, in its early centuries, Carthage was not yet a superpower. It was a trading post. A way station. A place where merchants stopped, exchanged goods, and moved on. But the location was perfect. Almost absurdly perfect. Carthage sat at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean Sea, where the distance between Africa and Sicily is barely 140 kilometers. Every ship sailing between the eastern and western Mediterranean had to pass close to Carthage. That made Carthage not just important. It made Carthage unavoidable. And the Carthaginians understood this better than anyone. They didn't build an empire by conquest first. They built it by commerce. By control of sea routes. By making themselves the middlemen of the ancient world, the people you had to deal with if you wanted to move goods across the Mediterranean. Tin from Britain, silver from Spain, slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, grain from Sicily, luxury goods from Egypt and the East. All of it flowed through Carthaginian hands. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage had become the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean world. Not Rome. Not Athens. Not Persia. Here's where the story gets deeply interesting, because Carthage was not just rich. It was built differently from every other great power of the ancient world, and that difference made it both uniquely powerful and uniquely hated. Most ancient empires were built around one thing: a king, a god-king, a pharaoh, a tyrant, some absolute ruler whose word was law. Carthage, from its very early history, built something closer to a republic. It had 2 elected magistrates called sophetes. A word that sounds almost like the Hebrew word shofet, meaning judge. It had a powerful senate of wealthy merchants and aristocrats. It had popular assemblies where citizens could vote. Sound familiar? It should. Because when the Romans eventually encountered Carthage up close, they were disturbed by how much it resembled Rome itself. Both were republics, at least in structure. Both had senates. Both had elected magistrates. Both built their power on commerce and military strength. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, actually studied the Carthaginian constitution and declared it one of the best in the world. He said Carthage had found a brilliant middle path between oligarchy and democracy that kept its citizens stable and satisfied. But here is where Carthage diverged sharply from Rome, and from almost everyone else. Carthage did not rely primarily on citizen soldiers. Rome's greatest strength was its citizen soldier model. When Rome went to war, Roman men, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, picked up weapons and fought for their homeland. That created a deeply personal investment in victory. Those men were fighting for their own land, their own families, their own identity. Carthage, by contrast, relied heavily on mercenaries. Professional soldiers from all over the Mediterranean and Africa. Numidian cavalry from the deserts of North Africa, Iberian infantry from Spain, Gauls from the north, Greek soldiers of fortune, Balearic slingers from the islands. These were some of the finest fighting men of the ancient world. And Carthage could afford to hire them, because Carthage was fabulously, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. This model had one enormous advantage: Carthage did not have to sacrifice its own citizens in war. The blood price of empire was paid by others. But it had one enormous weakness: mercenaries fight for money. And when the money runs out, or when the battle goes badly enough, mercenaries go home. Rome would eventually exploit this weakness. But first, Carthage and Rome had to actually find each other. For centuries, Rome and Carthage were not enemies. They barely knew each other. In 509 BCE, the very year Rome expelled its last king and declared itself a republic, Rome and Carthage signed a treaty. A commercial treaty. It defined their spheres of interest, regulated trade, and essentially acknowledged each other's existence as legitimate powers. This treaty is actually the earliest known document in Roman history. And it shows something remarkable: the Romans, at that point, were not in Carthage's league. The treaty is written almost entirely in Carthage's favor. It tells Roman merchants where they can and cannot sail, what ports they can use, what goods they can trade. Carthage is the senior partner. Rome is the newcomer trying to get a seat at the table. They renewed the treaty in 348 BCE, and again in 306 BCE. Each time, the relationship stayed relatively stable. They had no real territorial disputes, no major conflicts of interest. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean sea lanes. Rome was busy conquering Italy. Different spheres. No problem. And then Rome finished conquering Italy. And looked around. And saw Sicily. Sicily is a triangle of land sitting at the center of the Mediterranean, just off the toe of the Italian boot. It was, in the ancient world, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. Its volcanic soil produced extraordinary amounts of grain. Its position made it a perfect naval base. Whoever controlled Sicily effectively controlled the central Mediterranean. And in the 3rd century BCE, Sicily was divided. The eastern part was dominated by Greek cities, rich, cultured, quarrelsome. The western part was controlled by Carthage. They had been there for centuries, and the Carthaginian presence in Sicily was deep and well established. In 264 BCE, a dispute broke out in the Sicilian city of Messana, modern Messina, right at the northeastern tip of the island. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines had seized the city, and they were now being threatened by the Greek king of Syracuse. They asked Rome for help. Rome said yes. That decision changed the world. Because once Rome sent troops to Sicily, Carthage sent troops to Sicily. And suddenly, two great powers were standing on the same small island, looking at each other across a very short stretch of ground. The First Punic War had begun. Punic, from the Latin punicus, meaning Phoenician. It's the Roman name for the Carthaginians, and it reflects exactly how the Romans saw them: as foreign, as Eastern, as fundamentally other. Even though, by this point, Carthage was in many ways more Roman than Roman. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. 23 years of brutal, grinding, exhausting conflict across Sicily and the surrounding seas. Both sides suffered catastrophic losses, not just in battle, but to storms. The Mediterranean is a notoriously dangerous sea, and Rome lost entire fleets to weather. Hundreds of ships. Tens of thousands of men. Sunk not by Carthaginian weapons but by waves. Rome lost more ships in that war than in any other conflict in history. And Rome kept building more ships and sending them back. That stubbornness, that absolute refusal to quit, is what made Rome different. Carthage was wealthier. Carthage had better sailors with centuries of experience. But Rome had something Carthage could never buy with money, a citizen-soldier mentality that treated defeat as a temporary inconvenience and victory as the only acceptable outcome. In 241 BCE, the First Punic War ended. Carthage lost. Rome took Sicily. For the first time in its history, Rome had a province outside of Italy. And Carthage, for the first time in its history, had been beaten. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in all of ancient history. Carthage, beaten and broke, faced a mercenary revolt. The mercenaries who had fought the war hadn't been paid, because Carthage was bankrupt from the war, and they turned on their employer. The resulting conflict, called the Mercenary War, was brutally savage. Carthage nearly ceased to exist. It didn't. It survived. And out of that survival came a man. His name was Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar was the Carthaginian general who had fought Rome in Sicily and never actually been defeated in battle. He had been surrendered, politically, while still unbeaten in the field. That humiliation burned in him like a coal that never went out. He crushed the mercenary revolt with terrifying efficiency. And then he turned his eyes west. To Spain. Hamilcar took his army to the Iberian Peninsula and spent years conquering and consolidating a new Carthaginian empire in Spain. The silver mines of Spain were almost as productive as the silver of any kingdom on earth. He was rebuilding Carthage's power base from scratch, not in Africa, not in Sicily, but in a new territory that Rome had not yet reached. He brought his sons with him. His son-in-law Hasdrubal. And his eldest son. His 9-year-old eldest son, who had begged to come with him on campaign. The story goes. And this story is told by Roman historians, who had every reason to embellish it, but who also had no reason to invent something that made their enemy sound terrifyingly formidable. The story goes that Hamilcar told his son, "You can come, but first you must swear an oath at the altar of the gods." The boy swore that he would be an eternal enemy of Rome. His name was Hannibal. In 221 BCE, Hannibal Barca became commander of Carthaginian forces in Spain. He was 26 years old. 2 years later, he triggered the Second Punic War by attacking the Spanish city of Saguntum, which was an ally of Rome. Rome sent ambassadors to Carthage demanding that Hannibal be handed over for punishment. Carthage refused. Rome declared war. And then Hannibal did something so audacious, so strategically insane, so breathtakingly bold that military historians are still arguing about it 2,000 years later. He didn't wait for Rome to come to him. He took his army. Roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, and he marched north. Through Spain, through the south of France, through the Alps. He crossed the Alps. In winter. With elephants. When he came down out of the mountains into northern Italy, he had lost perhaps a third of his army to cold, starvation, and impossible terrain. He was deep in enemy territory, with no supply line, no reinforcements, and no fleet to support him. And he won. The Battle of the Trebia River, Roman disaster. The Battle of Lake Trasimene, Roman catastrophe. 15,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon in an ambush so perfectly executed that it remains a case study in military schools to this day. And then came Cannae. August 2, 216 BCE. Southeastern Italy. The Romans assembled the largest army they had ever put in the field, somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 soldiers. The intention was simple: overwhelm Hannibal with sheer numbers. Crush his smaller force by mass. What happened instead is taught in every military academy in the world. Hannibal allowed the Roman center to push forward, actually encouraged it, by putting his weakest troops in the middle and letting them bend backward under Roman pressure. As the Romans surged forward, thinking they were winning, Hannibal's stronger troops on both flanks swung around. Like two arms closing around a body. The Romans were encircled. 70,000 Roman soldiers died that day. In a matter of hours. It remains one of the worst military defeats in the history of Western civilization. The U.S. Army still studies Cannae. Every officer candidate at West Point learns it. Because what Hannibal achieved that day, the double envelopment, the destruction of a numerically superior force, was so tactically perfect that it has never been fully replicated. Rome was shattered. Multiple consuls were dead. Entire senatorial families had been wiped out. Allied Italian cities began switching sides, joining Hannibal. The road to Rome was open. Hannibal looked at Rome. And did not march on it. Why? Why didn't Hannibal march on Rome after Cannae? This is the question that Hannibal's own officers asked him on that battlefield. Maharbal, his brilliant cavalry commander, came to him after the victory and said, and this line has been quoted for 2,000 years, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." Historians have argued about this ever since. Some say Hannibal simply didn't have the siege equipment to take a major fortified city. Some say he was waiting for Carthage to send reinforcements and supplies that never came. Some say he believed Rome would negotiate peace after Cannae, and when they didn't, when Rome's Senate refused every overture, refused to ransom their own captured soldiers, refused to treat with him at all, he was strategically stuck. Some say Hannibal made a fatal miscalculation about Rome itself. He expected Rome to behave the way other ancient powers behaved, to acknowledge defeat after a catastrophic loss and come to terms. But Rome had something no other power in the ancient world had. An absolute, almost pathological refusal to accept defeat as final. The Roman Senate, after Cannae, did something extraordinary. They lowered the property qualification for military service. They freed and armed slaves. They drafted men who had never fought. They sent boys into the legions. And they kept fighting. Hannibal spent 15 more years in Italy. 15 years of marching, raiding, winning smaller battles, trying to break Roman resolve. The Italian countryside was devastated. Whole regions were depopulated. And still Rome would not quit. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio was doing something no Roman had tried, taking the war to Carthage. He went to Spain and drove the Carthaginians out. Then he did the unthinkable, he crossed into Africa. Carthage panicked. They recalled Hannibal from Italy. And in 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama in North Africa, Scipio defeated Hannibal. The greatest general in the ancient world, beaten on African soil by the student who had spent his whole life studying the master's methods. Scipio would be called Africanus. Hannibal would spend the rest of his life in exile, running from Rome, advising Rome's enemies, until he finally poisoned himself rather than be captured. His last words, according to one account, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too hard to wait for an old man's death." The Second Punic War ended in 201 BCE. Carthage surrendered. Rome stripped it of its fleet, its overseas territories, its ability to make war without Roman permission. Carthage was beaten. Again. But not destroyed, and here we reach the heart of the story. Because what happened after the Second Punic War is almost harder to explain than the war itself. Carthage was defeated. Humiliated. Stripped of power. And yet, within a generation it began to recover. Not militarily. Rome had made sure of that. But economically. Commercially. Because the Carthaginians were, at their core, merchants. And merchants find a way. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage was wealthy again. Not as powerful as before, but rich. Its farms were productive. Its trade routes were functioning. Its population was growing. It was paying off its massive war indemnity to Rome ahead of schedule. And in Rome, one man watched this with growing fury. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato. Cato the Elder. Roman senator. Moralist. Veteran. And the most prominent voice of a particular Roman anxiety, the fear that Carthage was not finished. Cato had visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and come back appalled. Appalled by its wealth. Appalled by its population. Appalled by its resilience. He came back to Rome and reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, on any topic, on any subject, whether he was discussing agriculture or road building or grain prices, with the same 5 words. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. Every single speech. 4 years. This was not just personal obsession. Cato was expressing a Roman anxiety that went deep. Deeper than strategy. Deeper than politics. An almost primal fear that Carthage would recover, rearm, and come back. That the nightmare of Hannibal would repeat. That some future Carthaginian general would again march through the Alps, again envelop Roman legions, again bring Rome to the edge of extinction. Rome had beaten Carthage twice. And twice, Carthage had come back. The idea that it might come back a 3rd time, that was intolerable. But here is the extraordinary thing, Rome's own best men argued against destroying Carthage. Scipio Nausicaa, the nephew of Scipio Africanus, the man who had actually beaten Hannibal, argued in the Senate that Rome should not destroy Carthage. His reasoning was sophisticated and, in retrospect, almost prophetic. He said, Carthage is what keeps Rome disciplined. The fear of Carthage is what keeps Roman citizens united, what keeps Roman soldiers tough, what keeps Roman politicians from tearing each other apart in factional warfare. If you destroy Carthage, you destroy the external pressure that holds Rome together. Take away the threat, and Rome will turn on itself. He was right. Frighteningly right. Within a generation of Carthage's destruction, Rome would descend into the civil wars that eventually ended the Republic and produced the Empire. Scipio Nausicaa saw it coming. But Cato's voice was louder. And Cato's fear was more visceral. And eventually, Cato's argument won. Rome needed a reason. Because Carthage had not actually done anything to justify war. It was paying its indemnity. It was not building warships. It was not recruiting armies. It was just existing. Recovering. Getting wealthy again. Rome manufactured a reason. Carthage had a neighbor, the Numidian king Massinissa, who had been Rome's ally in the Second Punic War. And Massinissa, in his old age, had been steadily encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Raiding. Stealing. Nibbling away at Carthaginian farmland, year after year. Carthage complained to Rome. Rome did nothing, or worse, sided with Massinissa. This went on for decades. Finally, in 150 BCE, Carthage did what any nation would do when its territory is repeatedly invaded and its appeals for justice are ignored. It fought back. It raised an army and attacked Massinissa. This violated the peace terms of 201 BCE, which said Carthage could not make war without Roman permission. Rome had its excuse. Rome declared war. And then, in an act of diplomatic cruelty almost without parallel in ancient history, Rome pretended it might not go to war after all. Rome sent envoys to Carthage demanding negotiations. Carthage, desperate to avoid destruction, agreed to every demand. Give up your weapons. They gave up their weapons, 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults. Give up hostages, 300 sons of the Carthaginian nobility were sent to Rome. And then the Roman envoys delivered the final demand. Abandon your city. Relocate 10 miles inland from the sea. Abandon Carthage. This was not a demand for submission. This was a death sentence. A city of merchants, 10 miles from the sea, with no port, no ships, no trade, it would wither and die within a generation. The Carthaginians understood exactly what this meant. They refused. And in that refusal, in that moment when a disarmed, hostage-giving, desperate people said, "No, we will not abandon our city," something remarkable happened. Carthage came alive. The city that had been humiliated, stripped, and broken, rose up. They melted down bronze statues to make weapons. Women cut off their hair to make ropes for catapults. They worked day and night, building new swords, new spears, new armor with their bare hands. An entire city transformed itself into a weapons factory in a matter of weeks. And then they fought. The Third Punic War lasted 3 years. 149 to 146 BCE. 3 years of the most savage urban warfare in the ancient world. Rome surrounded Carthage with its legions, blockaded its harbor, and waited. And attacked. And was repulsed. And attacked again. Carthage fought with an intensity that stunned its Roman besiegers. The city had massive walls, some of the most formidable defensive fortifications in the ancient world, stretching 22 miles around the peninsula, 30 feet thick, 6 stories high with towers every 200 feet. Taking those walls was not a simple matter of bringing up ladders. The Romans tried and failed, year after year. The first 2 Roman commanders of the siege accomplished essentially nothing. The war was embarrassing for Rome, the mighty empire, unable to take one desperate city. Then Rome sent a new commander. Scipio Aemilianus. The adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. A man who had grown up in the shadow of his great-grandfather's legacy, who understood what Carthage meant to Rome, and who was utterly determined to end it. Scipio was methodical. Where previous commanders had attacked and failed, Scipio built. He constructed a massive mole, a stone and earth barrier, blocking Carthage's harbor entrance, cutting off any hope of resupply by sea. He tightened the encirclement. He starved the city. And in the spring of 146 BCE, he attacked. Roman soldiers breached the outer walls and began fighting their way through the streets. What followed was 6 days of the most brutal house-to-house combat imaginable. The streets of Carthage ran in blood. The Carthaginians fought from rooftop to rooftop, from room to room, from floor to floor. Roman soldiers had to hack their way through buildings, floor by floor, bodies falling around them. 50,000 Carthaginians were taken prisoner. They would be sold into slavery. The city's population, which had been perhaps 500,000 at its height, was almost entirely killed or enslaved. The citadel, the Bursa, the great fortified hill at the heart of Carthage, was the last to fall. When it did, the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal came out and surrendered himself to Scipio. He begged for mercy. His wife, standing on the burning walls of the citadel, looked down at her husband prostrating himself before the enemy, turned to her children, and threw herself and the children into the flames. Scipio Aemilianus watched Carthage burn. And then he did something unexpected. He wept. He turned to his companion, the historian Polybius, who would record this moment for all time, and he quoted Homer. Lines from the Iliad about the fall of Troy. And he said, "I fear that someday the same fate will befall my own city." The man who destroyed Carthage was weeping for Rome. After the city was destroyed, Rome allegedly sowed Carthaginian soil with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Here is a thing you need to know: this probably did not happen. The story of Rome salting the earth of Carthage is one of the most repeated facts in history. It appears in documentaries, textbooks, novels, movies. And it almost certainly is not true. The first written reference to Rome salting Carthage's land appears, not in any ancient source, but in a 1930 academic article by an American historian named B.H. Warmington. No Roman author, no Greek author, no source contemporary with the event ever mentions salt. Polybius describes the destruction in detail. Appian describes it. Neither mentions salt. The story became attached to Carthage probably because salting conquered land was a real symbolic practice in the ancient world, performed in some places, mentioned in some texts. But no ancient source places it at Carthage specifically. What Rome actually did was order the destruction of the physical city, the walls torn down, the buildings burned and demolished. And then, within a few years, establish a Roman colony on the same site. That is perhaps the most revealing fact of all. Rome destroyed Carthage. And then built a new city on its ruins. A Roman city. Called, simply, Carthage. The city Rome was too afraid to destroy while it lived. Rome rebuilt and kept for itself after it died. Here is the deepest irony of the whole story. Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE. Completely, deliberately, thoroughly. It erased the physical city. It killed or enslaved the population. It tore down the walls. It burned the buildings. It obliterated, as completely as any ancient power ever managed to obliterate anything, the material existence of Carthage. And then spent the next several centuries being haunted by it. Roman writers returned to Carthage again and again. Virgil, writing the Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, made Carthage central to the story. His hero Aeneas, the mythological founder of Rome, lands in Carthage and falls in love with its queen, Dido. Their love affair, their tragedy, becomes a metaphor for the entire Rome-Carthage relationship: attraction and destruction, intimacy and violence, love and war inextricably tangled. Virgil's Dido is one of the most sympathetic characters in all of Roman literature. She is brilliant, capable, heartbroken, destroyed by forces beyond her control. Roman readers wept for her. Roman readers identified with her. And she was Carthaginian. Rome could not write its own founding myth without putting Carthage at the center of it. Rome could not tell the story of what it was without telling the story of what Carthage was and what it had done to Carthage. The city they destroyed lived inside them. And there is the strategic reality: Scipio Nausicaa was right. Within 50 years of Carthage's destruction, Rome's legendary civic discipline began to crack. The civil wars started. Marius versus Sulla. Caesar versus Pompey. The Republic, which had held together for centuries under the external pressure of threat and competition, began to tear itself apart from within. Without an enemy worthy of its fear, Rome found enemies in itself. Today, on the coast of Tunisia, a few kilometers outside the capital Tunis, you can visit Carthage. What you see is a quiet, almost peaceful place. Roman ruins, mostly, because the Romans built so thoroughly on Carthaginian foundations that Carthaginian ruins are buried deep. The Bursa Hill is there. The harbor basins, called the Kothan, are still visible, silted and still, where once the greatest naval fleet in the Mediterranean was moored. Archaeologists have found what they call the Tophet, a sacred precinct where, according to ancient sources, child sacrifices were performed. This was one of the charges Romans made against Carthage, that they burned children alive as offerings to their gods Baal Hamon and Tanit. The archaeology is genuinely contested. Some scholars believe the remains show evidence of real child sacrifice. Others argue the children found in the Tophet died of natural causes and were given sacred burial, not killed. We may never fully know. What we do know is that this charge, the story of child sacrifice, became one of the ways Rome justified its destruction of Carthage. It was propaganda, almost certainly exaggerated. But effective propaganda. It made Carthage not just an enemy but a moral abomination. Something the world was better without. This is what victors always do to the cities and peoples they destroy: they write the story afterward. They decide what is remembered, and what is monstrous, and what was necessary. Carthage cannot speak for itself. Its literature, and it had literature, its own histories, its own philosophy, its own agricultural texts, all of it is lost. The great library of Carthage, if it existed, burned. We know Carthage almost entirely through Roman and Greek sources. Through the words of its enemies. Imagine if you were known to history only through the words of the people who destroyed you. So why does this story matter? Why should you care about a city that was destroyed 2,169 years ago? Because Carthage and Rome together constitute one of the most important experiments in history about how civilizations work, compete, and destroy each other. Rome did not destroy Carthage because Carthage was evil. It destroyed it because it was afraid. Because Carthage represented the one thing Rome had never been able to fully conquer. An alternative model of how a great civilization could be built. Commerce instead of conquest. Naval power instead of land power. Mercenary professionalism instead of citizen sacrifice. oligarchic merchant rule instead of senatorial aristocracy. Carthage was not Rome's opposite. It was Rome's shadow self. The road not taken. The answer to the question, what if the great Mediterranean civilization had been built on trade and sea power rather than military expansion and land empire? And Rome, which had beaten Carthage twice and would beat it a third time, was never able to fully eliminate that question from its mind. Cato's obsession was not really about military threat. Carthage after 201 BCE was no military threat to Rome. It was about something deeper, the anxiety of an empire that had built itself through constant external conflict, looking at a city that embodied a different way of being powerful, and finding that it could not tolerate that alternative existing in the world. Hannibal crossing the Alps is one of history's greatest individual achievements. But the moment that haunts me most in this story is not Cannae. It's the Roman Senate, after Cannae, deciding not to negotiate. Deciding that no defeat was final. Deciding that the only acceptable outcome was total, complete, absolute victory. That decision, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, saved Rome in 216 BCE. And it doomed Carthage in 146 BCE. And it eventually doomed Rome itself, because a civilization that cannot conceive of any outcome except total victory eventually runs out of enemies to defeat and turns its violence inward. Scipio wept watching Carthage burn because he understood this. The man who destroyed Carthage was the one man in Rome who truly understood what Rome was destroying, and what it would cost. There is a suburb of Tunis today called Carthage. People live there. Children go to school. Cafes serve coffee. Life happens on the soil where once the greatest rival Rome ever faced built its civilization and met its end. Underneath the Roman ruins are Carthaginian ruins. Underneath the Carthaginian ruins are Phoenician foundations. And underneath all of it is the original rock of the African peninsula where someone, sometime around 814 BCE, looked at a perfectly positioned piece of land on the narrowest stretch of the Mediterranean Sea and thought, here is where we build. They built something that lasted 700 years. They built something that nearly destroyed the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen. They built something that forced their conqueror to define itself in opposition to them, and then to rebuild on their ashes. They built something that still whispers its name across 21 centuries. Carthage. Carchedon. Carthago. Carthage. The new city. The city Rome was too afraid to destroy, until it wasn't. And couldn't forget, ever after.